not a whole lot of folks who have done, multiple episodes. I told you before we hit record, I just love who you are and I love how you are. I love your message. You're passionate about it for all the right reasons. You're not just doing the rounds to pitch your book or to pitch your thing or your leadership coaching. This just comes from like the soul and the depths of the DNA of who you are. So really excited to have you back here.
Thanks, Jim. I think probably I get in trouble sometimes because I guess I don't talk enough about like the book and those things. But for me, it's those are just an extension of the message and what's really at play here. And so I like to just tell stories and see where they go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've got some good ones. So let's talk about your latest story. Your latest book is Nobody is Coming to Save You, a
Yeah.
Green Beret's Guide to Getting Big Shit Done.
Yeah.
Why did you write this book?
I've been writing this book for 6 years and I've been wanting to put out a book because people would ask me, how did you do Pineapple Express? Or how did you put a play together and learn how to act when you were 50 and get with Gary Sinise and get this thing on the road and do those kind of strategic things when in reality you weren't qualified to do it. And I think that comes from a place in my origins as a Green Beret and what I was taught as a young Green Beret about how to work from the bottom up, that it's very relevant where we are today, particularly when you look at how disconnected we are. And it's just, to me, it's very similar. What you see in our country today, in our civil society, is very similar to a lot of the low trust, high stakes places I worked as a Green Beret, that same kind of churn. And so I thought, well, if I could capture that methodology in such a way that it could show up as best practices and techniques for leaders who are out there getting it done every day, battling against that same churn from the bottom up, then I owe them that. I owe that to the folks that I serve. So that was really the impetus for it. And it took a long time. I don't even know how many redos and rewrites, but I think we finally got it to a place where I'm really proud of this thing, and I think it's gonna help people.
A quick interruption. If you're too busy to set goals, or if you're unsure what the right goals are for you, or if you're just not clear on what's next for you in your business, in your life, I've got the solution you've been looking for. Join my free 7-day course designed for athletic-minded men who want to maximize their potential in business and life. And I'm going to help you create a clear plan for achieving your biggest goals faster. So if you feel like you're driving with the parking brake on, if you feel like you're going 100 miles an hour all day long, but not really moving the needle in your life, get started with me today. Get instant access to this 7-day course where you and I will get to interact live with each other. Plus, you'll have access to a community of like-minded, high-performing, athletic-minded, competitive men looking to unlock their next level as well. Just visit jimharshawjr.com/free. That's jimharshawjr.com/free. Now, back to the show. You talk about low trust, high stakes environments. And to a certain extent, we're all living in that. And you talk about this in the book. Like, we're all living in that all day, every day, especially in this political season that we're in
Yeah.
right now. You live this at a much more intense level, right? Much more acute level. You open the book by talking about when your helicopter touches down in a remote village in Afghanistan. Can you take us back to that moment? Because that mission seems to be, obviously it's very, very relevant to this low trust, high stakes environment that you talk about and kind of where your philosophy grew from. Can you take us back to that moment when the helicopter touched down and what your mission was?
Yeah, the mission was called Village Stability Operations, and it was basically a modern day Magnificent Seven, a kind of a bottom up operation about 10 years into the Afghan war when we realized we were losing the war. There were more Taliban in the rural areas than when we had started. And a big reason for that was that for 10 years, we had focused on getting payback and retribution from 9/11 and kind of walking the enemy down and then trying to project a top down Western style approach in a country that was very busted up, very infested with disconnection and distrust. And rather than working at the community level, the bottom up level, which is what Green Berets have done since World War II, we tried to come from the wrong direction. And so I was fortunate enough to be part of that mission that was a reset, basically, in the Special Forces approach. And the way I opened the book is in one of those villages, was going in there to engage with a community that was very, very oppressed, that was very, very disconnected from themselves, from their neighbors, and certainly from us, and then building relationships that would ultimately empower those folks to go up on their own rooftops and defend themselves the way they had done for centuries. But it was based on the social capital and rapport that was built when nobody was looking. And that is the essence of what I learned as a Green Beret. I can't tell you how many times, Jim, a senior non-commissioned officer would tell me as a young junior officer, "Hey, sir, nobody's coming to save us. It's just us." And then he would say something like, "But we got a good team. We're going to be fine." And then this little team, would go in with 12 and come out with 120. And that to me is indicative of where we are today. You're right. Different stakes. The stakes in some ways are higher in those rough villages, but in many ways, maybe not. Maybe where we are today as a civil society, it is unprecedented. And I think that what got us here is not going to get us there. We need new approaches to leadership that are based on a lot of these old school interpersonal skills that we did as Green Berets that still are done out there in the rough places, and making leaders at home more aware of those so they can put them into play.
What was that like going into that village? I mean, what did the villagers say to you? What did the leaders say to you? How did that go?
I think what I try to explain to people is you imagine a village that's been at war for 40 years, where even the children have post-traumatic stress. The Green Beret, Patrick Christian, he's an anthropologist. He calls it inescapable shock. The people that live there, they can't move between fight and flight. They're in a trance-like state. They're in a churn of disengagement where they don't have purpose. They're in a churn of distraction where the least little thing pulls them off track, and they're in a churn of disconnection. They don't trust each other. They don't trust their government. And they sure as hell don't trust us. And so trying to go in there with just a handful of folks and to make a connection like that, it's extremely, extremely difficult. And it starts with making a connection with one individual. You might have an elder sitting there looking at you, tickling the trigger of his AK-47, trying to decide if he's going to dispatch you or not. And you have 5 minutes to make a connection with that guy.
Wow.
To build some kind of rapport. And you have to be so intentional and so focused on that relationship. And imagine, I just think, well, what if we did that here at home? What if we were that intentional? What if we were that focused on the connections that we make with our kids, with our spouses, with the neighbor down the street when we're talking about politics? What if the relationship was the asset like that? What if we treated relationships in a precious way like that here at home, rather than casual, rather than as an inconvenience? And so that for me is what it was like. It was life or death, but it was all built on the kind of relationships you could build. That's what kept you alive, and I think that's very much true for us here today.
Before we get into, I want to take this and say, how can we apply this? How can the listener apply this? I really want to get into to a moment. A moment where you're there, you were looking eye to eye with a villager, and maybe you weren't sure how this interaction was going to go. Is there a specific moment or a person that you remember, time that you can tell us about where you really learned this lesson?
Yeah. There was one community in particular in northern Kandahar province where it was just so difficult to get into the community that they were very resistant. They were intimidated by, and this is actually a scene from my play as well, Last Out. And they were very, very resistant to working with the Green Berets in that village because the Taliban had their foot on their throat. And frankly, many of these old men, their sons were in the Taliban, so there were a lot of reasons not to work with us, but mostly it was just high intimidation. And I can remember going up on the rooftops of where our platform was, and defending whenever the village was attacked, and there would be nobody else around. There'd be nobody else there. And then this would go on for, days, sometimes weeks. And then all of a sudden in the middle of
the Taliban would come in and attack that village.
Yeah, they would attack the village sometimes within hours of a team getting in there, because they knew what that represented. They knew that a team moving into this community like that, growing their beards out, living in the community, represented a direct threat to their ability to influence that population, which was at the heart of their insurgency, right? And for years we had lived on these built up fire bases, basically driving to work. And when we changed that operating system and moved into the communities, that was a major warning flag to the Taliban. And so they would attack with unmitigated violence almost immediately. Think of like community policing in East LA. If you have a cop that moves into a community and parks his cruiser out front of his house, that guy's going to get hit, right? Because it represents a direct threat to the population that they need. And this is what would happen. And you go up on the rooftop and you defend yourself as best you can. And for the most part, the community's not coming up there. They're going to hang low. They're going to stay down below. And, you have to apply amazing restraint to not shoot back in a way that you're going to commit collateral damage. But at the same time, you have to defend yourself. And it's extremely difficult being up there on a rooftop like that by yourself and nobody following you, and this would go on again for days, weeks, sometimes months. And during the day, you go back out into the community, you drink tea, you engage the farmers, you try to find ways that you can be relevant, whether that's providing medical care to the kids. And then over time, incrementally, usually it would be when you least expected it, you would hear a gunshot off to your side and there would be a muzzle flash on another roof, but not shooting at you, shooting in the same direction as you are. And it would be one farmer up on his roof, defending his home the way he had always done, and then your team. And then a few nights later, there'd be two muzzle flashes up on two roofs. And then on and on it would go. And it was incremental. But before long, every village, every rooftop in the village would have rifle fire firing back as a collective. And over the years, I started to call that rooftop leadership, as I would bring these various senior leaders down to see this, because it was a phenomenon. It really turned the tide of the war about midway through. Osama bin Laden wrote to his intelligence chief that the program that we were doing represented the biggest threat to the insurgency in Afghanistan. That's the kind of effect that it was having. It was very bottom up, but it was big shit, man. And so when I unpack that and when I look at where we are today, it's the same approach. Humans are universally, similar in how we're wired to interact with each other. And it was really you build trust when risk is low and you leverage it when risk is high. That's why those guys eventually went up on the roof, is because of the trust that was built when risk was low during the day. Over time, social capital was established, and ultimately, one by one, they go up on that roof and stand up for themselves. And I think, honestly, in today's world that we live in, it's the same way. People aren't going to follow you initially, but if you just kind of stay committed to the relationships and the connections, eventually they will.
Yeah. How is that relevant for us right now? Whether it's politically, whether it's in our communities, whether it's just you're trying to win people to a new way of thinking. How do we do that? How do we use this for our own personal lives and professional lives?
I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. One is, first of all, is to think about the environment that we live in. A lot of times it's easy to say that the enemy is the Republican or Democrat that's across from you, or the person that doesn't wear a mask or wears a mask. But the reality is, I believe that the enemy, much like in Afghanistan, the enemy, yes, of course, the Taliban was the enemy, but the enemy was also the churn. It was that social disconnection that existed.
Talk about the churn. Can you define that? Because you've used that term, you talk about it in the book, but can you define that for the listener?
Yeah, it's really just a set of unprecedented social conditions that divides us as a population from each other and meeting our goals. And it really is brought about by a range of conditions that are, again, unprecedented. Many of them are kind of brought about by the modern world. They're brought about by external stressors, but they usually manifest in what I call the 4Ds: distraction, disengagement, disconnection, and distrust. And all of those, it's like the perfect storm. When those manifest like that, you have these conditions where basically you're in a trance state all the time, and you're disconnected from your neighbor. There's a lack of trust, and so you walk around almost all the time in a sympathetic state of fight, flight, or freeze. The least little thing can set you off. And if you see how we behave on social media, you see how we behave around the 24/7 news cycle, how people drive in public after COVID. Like, all of this is a manifestation of what I call the churn. It's an unprecedented set of social conditions that divide us. And if we don't recognize those conditions for what they are, then we start to label the neighbor across from us as the enemy. And they're not. The reality is, it's the same dude or dudette that you've been dealing with for years, right? But the conditions around us have changed. And so how you navigate that is really important. So the second thing I think that we can use to apply from that world that I lived in the world that we live in today is to think about our own human nature differently than we ever have before. What I call the human operating system. We've become so disconnected. We're also disconnected from our own nature. We forgot that we are a primal creature, right? We are a 250,000-year-old well-dressed Neanderthal. And the way that we handle the modern world, the brain has not evolved that much. Multitasking is a myth. These dopamine dispensers that we walk around with all the time, they put us in a trance-like state. And so there's just a range of modern realities that are pulling us away from our nature. So I say we got to get back to our nature. We have to understand that we are primal creatures that are focused on meaning, and we are emotional in how we navigate the world. We're social, we're storytellers, and we're all bound by struggle. We're a mess. That's the acronym that I use. And the more we can understand those realities, the more we can lead people in these modern problems. So the other piece of it is, like, I just think we need to understand our nature more and get back to who we are as a species and really understand that. And that's what I do in my book. I go really deep on what makes us tick. And then with that in mind, how do you make connections across that?
You experienced churn yourself at a very deep level. I mean, you at one point had a gun in your hand. You found
Yeah.
yourself in a closet in your house with a gun in your hand. Can you, if you're willing to, or can you share what led to that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I came back from being a very high performing guy in special forces, like, many special operators. I lived a life that was one by design. But it involved a lot of combat. But I lived the life I wanted to live, and I retired what I thought was on my terms. Came home in 2013, and still married, had my kids, was going to write a book, had a good job. But within 18 months, Jim, of taking off the desert boots and putting on the Tampa Bay flip flops, the snakes in my head started to squirm pretty hard. And one of the big reasons for that was all of the disconnection and churn that I saw in my own country. I came home to a country I didn't even recognize. Sebastian Younger, this guy, he writes in his book Tribe that most combat veterans are willing to die for their country, but they have no idea how they're supposed to live for it. And that's because it's hard to know how to live for a country that's tearing itself apart along every imaginable line, from race to economics to politics to religion. And that was true for me. That's what I felt like. I was like, I've lost all these friends. I've lost my entire adult life. I'm no longer part of that world. For what? So that we can sit here and literally behave the way we did over in Afghanistan, what I saw over there. And it just felt like it felt so empty. And it took me to a really dark place where I really started to question my purpose and my identity. And it opened the door for things that I had pressed down for years on the emotional side: post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, moral injury that I had not dealt with, didn't know how to deal with, and they came racing in. And it took me to a place where I was, standing in a closet holding a pistol with no intention of coming out in this very house. And, and had my son not come home from school when he did, I'm pretty confident I wouldn't be here. But the thought of my son finding me was enough to have me put the gun down, humiliated, ashamed. I didn't talk about it for years. I did not talk about that incident. But what did stay with me was, and it wasn't the only time I went in that closet either, but was that I felt like I had something to say, man. I felt like I had seen a world over there that looked a lot like the world over here, and that I had some things that I had learned that might be helpful. But every time I would try and talk about it, every time I would try to tell stories of what I'd learned, I would jam up, I would freeze up, I would experience severe anxiety. And I didn't know how to tell my story at all. And it was, I met a guy named Bo, who was a storyteller, and I talk about him in the book. He was a former NFL football player turned speaker. Yep, Bo Eason turned speaker. And he changed my life. He showed me how to use storytelling as a modality to heal myself, and then to bridge the civil military gap. And that's what I started to do. And I became obsessed with it, man. I became obsessed with this notion that storytelling, which is a sense-making tool biologically for us, and it is a real antibody to the churn, no matter what your profession is. And so I just immersed myself in the realm of storytelling. 3 TED Talks, hundreds of keynote speeches, going on the news as an analyst, learning how to become an actor, writing a play, anything that I could do that would stretch my comfort zone on storytelling, I did. And that became where I found most of my relevance, was teaching other people how to use storytelling in their own arena as a way to bridge gaps.
Yeah. Storytelling is one of the parts of your framework in terms of how we deal with churn and how we can,
Yeah,
face it, minimize it. I mean, we're surrounded by what you said earlier were the 4Ds: distraction, disengagement, disconnection, distrust. I mean, these are all
yeah,
around us. We're not going to
yeah,
completely escape these unless we, get off the grid and go
yeah,
back to our caveman days. But how do we manage this? You have your mess framework. Can you
yeah,
share that mess framework again with us and go,
yeah.
bullet point by bullet point on what these mean and how we use those?
Yeah, absolutely. I start off by basically making the case that we need to bridge this churn and to lead through it. We need to understand the human operating system. And at a macro level, the way I describe it is I use a metaphor, because the brain is a metaphorical pattern matching organ. The brain looks for metaphor to make sense of things. That's why songs and poetry and plays work so well in stories. And so the metaphor I use is the iceberg, right? The iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg is the modern world. And the bottom of the iceberg, below the waterline, the part you can't see, that's actually the largest part of the iceberg, that's the traditional world. That's where we all come from. That's the primal creature. And as humans, we are that full iceberg. We are the tip of the iceberg, which is about 20% of that iceberg is the modern world. It's the cash flow reports. It's binge watching Yellowstone. It's getting the kids to soccer practice on time, Zoom fatigue, all those things. And it feels like it's all consuming, but the bottom of the iceberg is really the bulk of our humanity. And it's the part we can't see. It's invisible, right? It's where we all come from. It's the traditional world. It's our ancestors. It's the hunters, the gatherers, because that is still our genetic and biological makeup. What we were 200,000 years ago is still what we are today. We just haven't changed that much. Adam Ghazali says in The Distracted Mind, we're still ancient brains trying to make sense of a high-tech world. So below the waterline
Yeah,
is
we
where
haven't had a chance to evolve yet.
No, we haven't. And that's why you see people have these primal responses to modern day problems that are totally inappropriate, right? So you might see somebody lose their shit over their 401k eroding over 6 months, right? And the amygdala doesn't know the difference. It's responding the same way it would if it was a saber-toothed tiger in the bushes. That's great if it's a saber-toothed tiger, but it's totally inappropriate, right? If you have that response in front of your team at an all hands meeting, because what happens is you're in survival mode. You're in a sympathetic state. You look like you don't trust yourself. When in reality, what you need to do is to connect with the people in that room and bridge that. But the way we are made up at a primal level, that's not the immediate response. And so the more we can understand about what's below the waterline, the more we can manage our own energy and the energy of those around us, right? And that's what I teach still to this day. Green Berets, federal law enforcement, and now corporate executives and salespeople is like, it's the same thing. So the acronym that I use to describe that creature that lives below the waterline is a creature that is focused on meaning, emotions, social connection, storytelling, and struggle. And those aren't the only things, but they are very, very significant. And if you can focus on those things as both lenses and levers in how you see your own behavior and the behavior around you and how you manage behavior and manage relationships, it's very effective. And so what I did was I just build one chapter in the book around each one of those and go super deep on it.
Tell us about finding meaning.
We're the most meaning seeking creatures in the world. We don't only seek meaning in what we do, we assign meaning to what we do. You know, Simon Sinek says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. He's absolutely right. We are driven by purpose. And in this day and age, what I'm seeing, and I teach and I speak across all kinds of industries, we have omitted purpose from most of what we do. We don't talk about the why. We have so much ambiguity and complexity around us. And what people crave in times of complexity and ambiguity is clarity. And the only way you can be clear is if you have a sense of purpose. It's the only way. And so we need to get back to the things that we do that help us get a sense of purpose, first for ourselves, getting clear on what that is. But then organizationally, what is the collective purpose of what we're trying to do? And leaders have to integrate that in what they talk about. One of the first things I talk about in that chapter is leaving tracks, which was a term my dad Rex used all the time and still does, about really leaving a legacy in this world. So kind of the North Star. And so I start that chapter off with helping leaders get a sense of what's the legacy that you're leaving behind, and how do you integrate that into every single thing you do every day of the week, and get real clear on that. Because if you're clear on your purpose, man, people know it. They feel safe and they want to be around you.
It makes things so much simpler when you have that clarity of purpose, right? I mean, a lot of my philosophy and my coaching framework comes from my experience as a college athlete. Like when I was competing as a college athlete, I had a purpose, right? It was very limited and maybe a little selfish at that point, but I still had this very clear purpose, which allowed me to do really hard things that nobody would consider doing, waking up early and doing ridiculous workouts and losing, 22 pounds in 2.5 days at one point. Like, just doing these kinds of things is really hard, and you can do hard things when there's purpose, right? And I make a distinction between hard work and inspired action. To call what I did when I was competing hard work is, yeah, it was a hard work, sure it was, but it's like almost unfair to call it that, because it was inspired, right? It was inspired by my purpose. And when you get clear on that, and I'm speaking to the listener right now, when you get clear on that, everything gets simpler. I'm not saying it gets easy. It just gets simpler. You find yourself more consistent, more focused, more disciplined in doing things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So.
You're also, that's really good. And you're less exposed to the churn. When you are clear on your purpose, you're less exposed to all the BS that's going on around you. I'll give you an example. The last time you and I were together, we talked about Pineapple Express, right?
Yep.
I went back through that chat room when I was writing Operation Pineapple Express. I went back through the Signal chat room. There were thousands, 150 veterans doing entries over like 11 days with, 7,000 people in our manifest. You can imagine thousands of entries. I went through all of them. The word Biden was mentioned one time. The word Trump, never. Now, think about this. 150 special operators whose partners have just been abandoned by both of these individuals, not just Biden. Trump's Doha agreement was very, very destructive in how we dealt with this problem. But yet it was only between the two of them, they were only mentioned one time. And how is that even possible? And I will tell you, it's because the myopic focus of honoring a promise, that was the only thing the guys were in there to do. They didn't have time for any of that crap. And I saw the same thing in combat. You saw the same thing as an athlete. The brain has a mandate to make sense of the world. It has a mandate. They call it the make sense mandate. That's what Dr. Kendall Haven calls it. And if you recognize that out of the gate as a leader and for yourself, and you feed that mandate, the life gets super clear, and the people around you feel much safer and they want to be around you.
So your acronym, ME and 3 S's. So we talked about meaning. Let's talk about emotions.
Yeah, emotion is a big one. It's probably the one I'm most concerned about, because there's this, in this tip of the iceberg world, we think that we are thinking creatures who happen to feel. Not true. We are emotional creatures who just happen to think, right? That frontal cortex is a fairly new thing in the evolution of humanity. The preponderance of our existence, of our brain, is quite primal, and we use emotions to navigate the world, right? Alan Weiss, $1 Million Consultant, says logic makes people think, emotions make people act. And what we've done in this modern tip of the iceberg world is we've pressed emotions down, right? It's just business. We don't have emotional access. We don't allow emotions to permeate how we navigate the world. We just press them down, and it's killing us. It's killing our first responders. It's killing our veterans. And I believe post-COVID, it's starting to we have a mental health tsunami in civil society right now.
Yeah, especially with our kids.
Yeah, and so we've got to learn how to manage emotional temperature. This is again, metaphorically what I use as a thermometer, right? When you look at our body, we go into a sympathetic state for fight, flight, or freeze when we're facing a crisis. And we then regulate to a parasympathetic state when the crisis is over to metabolize the trauma, process it, tell stories, learn from it, and heal and connect. So you go from fight, flight, or freeze to calm and connect, rest, and digest. And we did this thousands of years ago. If you and I and our clan dealt with a saber-toothed tiger, sympathetic state, deal with the tiger. Parasympathetic state, when we go back to the cave, bury our dead, treat our wounded, tell stories about what we learned, and heal, right? And metabolize the trauma. They work in tandem. But today, in this time of churn, because we're so disconnected from our nature, we're staying in a sympathetic state all the time. We're in a sympathetic state all the time, and we don't know how to manage our own state. And the body's not designed for that. The body is designed, you know this as an athlete, you episodically go into a sympathetic state to perform, and then you drop into a parasympathetic state. We've lost the ability to do that. We're staying in the red all the time, and it's creating this trance-like state because you're in a trance when you do that. You're in a trance of hyper-focus, and you're on full autopilot to just survive. And when you do that 80, 90% of the time, you look like you don't trust yourself, and you completely detach from the people around you. And that's what's, in my assessment, is causing the preponderance of the problems you see in the country today, to include the election.
Mm-hmm. The third letter in your the 5-part acronym, MESSS, the third letter is S, social connections.
Yeah, social connections. Think about it this way. Matthew Lieberman, in his book Social, he says that, humans are the most social creatures on the planet. We don't have fur, fangs, or claws, right? We sit on top of the food chain because we form teams better than any other mammal on the planet. That's how we survive, is we form groups. And we are predisposed to do that biologically. We're always semi-consciously looking to make connections. And I submit that in the modern world, particularly after 2+ years of isolation, we've lost a lot of our innate ability and appreciation for social connection. We're so isolated right now. And so what I'm trying to get us to get back to is, like we did in Afghanistan, the relationship has to be the asset. You put the relationship before the transaction. The reason that we were able to get 1,000 Afghans out of the country with our cell phones and really nothing else, no authority, no money, no resources, no access and placement, was because we had built trust when risk was low over 20 years, and we leveraged that trust when risk was high. And that is, to me, the way we need to navigate the world today. You build trust when risk is low, you leverage it when risk is high. And in order to do that, you have to put the relationship before the transaction. The relationship is the asset. Social capital is the most important capital in the world. If you have social capital, it's the oldest form, tangible, intangible linkages between humans. If you have that, everything else will flow from that, all other forms of capital.
And for the listener, you got to buy the book, because Scott talks about that social capital, that relationship capital, and how that played out in Afghanistan in building relationships with these villagers.
And a lot of techniques to use it today. So like that, in that chapter, I go deeper probably than any other chapter on how to build social capital as a bottom-up leader with no title, how you can build communities of practice. And I use the play Last Out. I use some other scenarios like Pineapple Express to show how basically you build these communities of practice around wicked problems, around hard problems. And you can, it's amazing what you can do if you make social connection the priority. But there's an approach to it that really works well. And that's what I try to hit hard in the book.
The next S is story.
Yeah, we're story animals. We've been telling stories for 70,000 years. And the thing that I think probably could most succinctly get at this is the brain has a mandate to make sense of the world, and it is a metaphorical pattern matching organ. In other words, it uses metaphor, narrative, story to make sense of things. The brain of your listener, of your child, of your client, and yours will tell itself a story in order to make sense of anything. So if you show a PowerPoint deck, right, and it's 70 slides long, David Phillips did a study that showed that your audience is going to forget 90% of your content 30 seconds after you say thank you for your time, because you're engaging working memory. Stories, they evoke long-term memory. They provide meaning and context and emotional connection. And so it becomes a vehicle by which you can bridge these gaps and people locate themselves in the story. Like if you've ever listened to a story and you almost start processing your own life in that story, it's called autobiographical listening or narrative transportation. And storytellers own every room they walk into, particularly today, because we are inundated with this short form, it's all about me communication stuff, and it's unwatchable. Storytellers are the ones that everybody will slow down for, even the distracted people. And I've seen it over and over again as a speaker. I test it in every forum I can go into, and I tell stories, and I hold every room I walk into. And I'm no different than anybody else. I just train my ass off at it. And that's what I would encourage people to do. And this book really lays out how to tell better stories, not just design them, but to tell them for maximum impact.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear, like, you didn't just become, you didn't just weren't just naturally a great storyteller. You've trained at it, you've worked at it, you've put effort into it.
You
And
do.
listeners would
Yeah.
have to do the same thing.
Yeah, because the tip of the iceberg world tells us not to do that. Everything in the modern world tells us not to tell stories. It pushes us away from that. And the reality is, I say go against the culture on that and become a storyteller.
The last S is struggle.
Yeah, and they kind of go hand in hand. Storytelling and struggle. I call it the generosity of scars, going back to my time in that closet. I didn't talk about it for years. And it was only when my seventh friend had committed suicide that I told my wife. I was like a couple of weeks out from a TED talk. And I said, I need to change my TED talk. And this was my third one. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, I need to talk about and I said my friend's name and suicide. And she's like, oh, so you want to talk about how it's affected your friends? I said, no, there's something you need to know. And that's when I told my wife. This was 2019. And it had been 2015, how long I'd carried it. Had to tell my boys, never told them. But I knew that if I could share that story, if I could repurpose that story of my struggle, of my scars in the service of other people, that maybe somebody would locate themselves in that story. Maybe somebody was sitting out in that audience who was hurting. Well, it turned out that happened again and again and again. And to this day, that TED Talk of all three has had over 1 million views. It has, I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me and said, hey, man, I was in that closet. Thank you. And so it really just drove home for me, Jim, that the two best stories we can share in this world, the two best scar stories, the second best is the story you don't want to tell other people. And the best one is the one you don't want to tell yourself. And if you're willing to take your struggles and put them into the service of other people, you become more relatable to their pain. It's a trust accelerant and it drops the armor and people will follow you up onto that rooftop. And I know it feels clunky and scary and vulnerable, but I am absolutely convinced in this time of churn that leaders who can integrate struggle into what they talk about, their own personal struggle, who can be relatable to the struggle of others, and even the struggle of their organizations, they're the ones that we feel the safest with, the most connected to, and the ones that we want to follow.
Scott, I told you I had you on this, wanted to have you back because you just ooze passion for what you do. I mean, your message is so powerful, and I'm glad that we can be a small part of amplifying your message. For the listener who is bought into what you're saying, we're going to have a link to where they can pre-purchase the book, which comes out in October, and we're publishing this prior to the launch of that. But you can, for the listener, you can do a pre-purchase of that book. We'll have the link to where the listeners can do that. What's an action item that the listener can do in the next, say, 24 to 48 hours to start following through on what you taught us here today?
You know what? I would say let's take storytelling as an action item, and let's do this. It's not always the stories. In fact, it's most of the time it's not the stories you tell; it's the stories you ask to hear. And so, find 3 opportunities to ask thoughtful, open-ended questions of people in your life, and allow them to respond in story. Right? Questions that either start with how or what. Just an open-ended, calibrated question that lets them respond to you in a story, right? It could even be something as simple of, well, what's the biggest lesson you learned from all of that? Or how did that compare to this when you were going through that? And just watch the look on their face, because no one ever gets asked those questions. Yeah. Watch the way they respond and notice the connection that starts to happen at a palpable semi-conscious level. Thoughtful, Chris Voss calls them calibrated questions in Never Split the Difference. Questionology that let the other party tell you a story it's 2/3 of every high stakes engagement. And the cool thing is you can start right now with the people you love, because they're usually the ones we blow it off with the most.
What a fantastic action item that's going to help us and help those that we love. Where can people find you, follow you, buy the book as when it's on goes on pre-sale here, Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Scottmann.com, two T's, two N's. The book is there. We've got some pretty cool things that are coming down with the book. We're going to have a live event in the fall where we're going to do tons of storytelling at a dude ranch that I do twice a year. It's pretty fun. All that's at scottmann.com. And also the rooftop, I do my own rooftop podcast where I usually walk down my driveway out here and riff on this stuff. Yeah, all of that's at scottmann.com.
Excellent. We'll have links to all that in the action plan. Scott, thanks so much for making time to come on the show again.
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you for what you do. And thanks for having me on.